At the family meeting, my daughter looked straight at me and said, "Mom, my mother-in-law was right." The room went silent. Not the ordinary silence that happens when people run out of words. This one felt heavy. Dangerous. Before I could even understand what she meant, my brother slowly stood up from his chair. He looked at me the way people look at strangers. Then he said quietly, "You should have stayed out of this, Rachel." My chest tightened so suddenly I had to grip the edge of the table. Because in that moment I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a family argument. It wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a trap. And somehow, everyone in that room knew it. Everyone except me. Before I tell you what really happened that night, I'm truly glad you're here listening. If stories like this interest you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps these stories reach more people. That morning had felt completely ordinary. Cold autumn air drifted through the small town of Redwood Hollow, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves. The trees along the main road had already turned shades of deep orange and gold, and the sidewalks were covered with dry leaves that crackled softly under passing footsteps. I remember noticing how beautiful everything looked. Sometimes life becomes most peaceful just before it breaks. I had gone to the farmer's market like I always did on Saturdays. Routine had become important to me over the years. After Emily moved to the city, the house felt too quiet if I didn't keep my small habits. The market stood near the courthouse square, where the same vendors had been setting up wooden tables for decades. Old canvas tents flapped gently in the breeze while people wandered slowly from stall to stall. I greeted familiar faces. Mrs. Coleman was arranging apples in careful rows when I approached. "Rachel," she said with a warm smile, brushing floury dust from her hands onto her apron. "You're later than usual today." "I slept in a little," I replied. "Don't tell anyone." She laughed softly and handed me a red apple to taste. I bought 3 pounds for jam and a jar of honey I didn't really need. We talked for a few minutes about the early frost that had crept into the valley overnight. Farmers always talk about the weather like it's a living thing. Nothing about that morning felt unusual. No sign. No warning. If someone had told me that before sunset I would find my daughter lying in the dirt, fighting to breathe, I would have smiled politely and assumed they were talking about someone else's life. Not mine. When I finally headed home, my old pickup truck rattled along the gravel road the way it always did. The engine had been making that same tired sound for years. The radio played quietly in the background. Some old country song about lost love and dusty highways. I wasn't really listening. I remember watching the sky instead. The clouds were low and gray, and the daylight already looked dim even though the afternoon had barely begun. Autumn days end early here. As the truck rolled slowly toward home, I felt something rare. Peace. Not excitement. Not joy. Just the quiet comfort of a normal day. Back then I believed ordinary days would continue forever. I had no idea how fragile ordinary life really was. When I pulled into my driveway, the house greeted me with the same stillness it always had. A white wooden porch. 2 rocking chairs that rarely moved anymore. And the faint creak of old floorboards whenever the wind pushed against the walls. I carried the apples inside and set them on the kitchen counter. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon from the candle I had burned the night before. For a moment, I stood there looking toward the hallway. Emily's room was at the end of it. She hadn't lived there for years, of course. But I had never changed anything. The same pale curtain still hung over the window. The same stack of books sat on her desk. And on the dresser was a photograph taken beside Lake Harrison when she was 10 years old. In the picture she was missing one front tooth and laughing so hard her eyes were almost closed. I had always thought those small details were meaningless. Just sentimental things mothers keep because they don't know how to let go. But later, those small details would become something else entirely. Clues. Memories. Proof of a life that once felt safe. I had planned to spend the evening quietly. Maybe cook something simple. Maybe read for a while. Nothing dramatic. Nothing important. Just another calm Saturday fading slowly into night. But life rarely asks permission before it changes everything. And only a few minutes later, my phone rang. My phone rang just as I was pulling into the driveway. The sound cut sharply through the quiet of the truck. I glanced at the screen. Unknown number. For a moment, I considered letting it ring. These days, unknown numbers usually meant sales calls or someone trying to offer services I never asked for. But something about it made me hesitate. A strange feeling settled in my chest. So I answered. Hello? A man's voice came through the speaker. Nervous. Slightly breathless. Is this Rachel Carter? Yes, I said slowly. There was a short pause on the other end of the line, as if he wasn't sure how to continue. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. You need to come to the old quarry road, now. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Why? For a moment I heard only whine through the phone and the faint sound of a passing car somewhere near him. Then he spoke again. I found a woman here, he said carefully. She has your number in her wallet. The world seemed to narrow to a single point. My throat felt suddenly dry. What's her name? I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. When he finally answered, his voice had become much quieter. Emily. For a second the name didn't register in my mind. It floated there like a word in a dream. Then the meaning struck me all at once. My daughter. Is she hurt? I demanded. The man hesitated again. Yes. The word was barely audible. My heart began pounding so loudly that I could hear it in my ears. How badly? I asked. She's been beaten, he said. Badly. Everything inside me seemed to collapse at once. The world outside the truck, my quiet porch, the autumn trees, the peaceful afternoon, suddenly felt distant and unreal. Where exactly are you? I asked, already turning the key in the ignition. Old Quarry Road, he repeated. Near the south entrance. The call ended before I could ask anything else. For a moment I sat frozen in the driver's seat. My hands were shaking. Emily lived in the city nearly 2 hours away. What could she possibly be doing on that road? My mind searched desperately for explanations. An accident. A misunderstanding. Anything except the truth my instincts were already whispering. I pushed the thought away and pressed the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, gravel spraying behind the tires as I turned onto the main road. I don't remember much about that drive. Only fragments. The way the speedometer needle climbed higher than it should have. The blur of trees rushing past the windows. The sound of my own breathing, fast and uneven. Every few seconds I checked the road ahead as if expecting something to appear there. My hands kept tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned pale. 10 minutes later the paved road ended. Old Quarry Road began as a narrow stretch of dirt cutting through thick forest. Few people used it anymore. The quarry itself had been abandoned years earlier, leaving behind only silent pits and broken gravel paths. The truck bounced violently as I drove faster than the road allowed. Dust rose behind me like smoke. Then, in the distance, I saw a car parked crookedly near the edge of the clearing. A man stood beside it, waving his arms. I slammed the brakes. Before the truck had fully stopped, I opened the door and ran toward him. Where is she? I shouted. He pointed toward the ground near the roadside ditch. And that was when I saw her. Emily lay half on the dirt road, half in the grass. Her coat was torn. One sleeve hung loosely, ripped almost to the shoulder. Her hair, once carefully brushed that morning, I realized later, was tangled and dark with blood. For a moment I could not move. The world seemed to tilt slightly, like a picture frame sliding off a wall. Then instinct took over. I dropped to my knees beside her. "Emily," I whispered. Her face was swollen and bruised. One eye was almost completely closed. Her breathing was shallow. But she was alive. Relief struck me so hard it almost felt like pain. I lifted her head carefully and held it in my hands. "Emily, sweetheart. I'm here." Her eyelids fluttered weakly. For a second I thought she might lose consciousness again. Then her lips moved. Barely. And she whispered something I would never forget. It was Margaret. When I saw my daughter lying there in the dirt, barely breathing, my whole body seemed to go cold from the inside out. I kept one hand under her head and the other pressed against her shoulder, as if simple touch could hold her to this world. The man who had called me hovered a few feet away, helpless and pale. I could hear him asking whether he should call an ambulance again, whether he should get water, whether he should do something, anything at all. But his words sounded distant. Everything sounded distant except Emily's breathing. It came in thin, uneven pulls. I had never heard my child breathe like that before. There is something unnatural about seeing your grown daughter suddenly look small again. Emily was a married woman. She lived in the city. She managed committees, events, schedules, budgets, all those polished adult things I used to admire from a distance. But there in the dirt, with blood caught in her hair and one hand curled weakly against her chest, she looked almost like the little girl who used to wake from thunderstorms and run barefoot into my room. I kept saying her name. Quietly. Steadily. Not because I thought she needed to hear it, but because I needed to keep hearing myself speak. If I stopped speaking, I felt I might start screaming. Her eyelids trembled. She tried to move, and pain crossed her face so sharply that I had to swallow hard to keep my own fear from spilling out. She whispered Margaret's name once more, then lost the strength to continue. I wanted to ask questions. I wanted to understand what had happened, why she was here, who had brought her, how long she had been lying on that road. But none of those questions mattered as much as the fact that she was still alive. I leaned closer and brushed the hair back from her forehead. That was when the memory came to me. Not gently. Not in the soft way old memories usually arrive. It struck with the force of something already waiting beneath the surface. I suddenly remembered the first day Emily brought Ryan Blake home. She had called 2 days earlier and told me she wanted me to meet someone important. I could still hear the careful brightness in her voice. She was trying not to sound too excited, which told me she already was. I spent the entire morning cleaning even though the house was already clean. I changed the tablecloth in the kitchen. I baked a chicken because Emily always said no one roasted one the way I did. I even put out the good serving bowl with the blue flowers around the edge, the one I saved for holidays and company. When they finally drove up, I was standing at the front window pretending not to watch. Ryan got out first. He was tall, handsome in that polished way city men often are, with a pressed shirt, expensive shoes, and a smile ready before he even reached the porch. He carried a bottle of wine I knew at a glance was far more expensive than anything I would have bought for myself. Emily stepped out behind him, cheeks pink from the drive, eyes bright. She looked happy. Truly happy. And that mattered more to me than the car, the clothes, or the easy confidence he wore like a second skin. He shook my hand, then laughed and said, "No, that's too formal. Emily's mother deserves a proper hug." So he hugged me. Warmly. Politely. Perfectly. At the time, I thought that was a good sign. Inside, he complimented the house, thanked me for dinner, asked questions about the town, listened when I answered. Some men only know how to wait for their turn to speak. Ryan knew how to listen just enough to make people trust him. I saw how naturally Emily leaned toward him, how her whole body softened in his presence. It pleased me, though I would not admit it then. I had raised her to be careful, and here she was, already giving her heart away. Then his mother arrived. Margaret Blake was not what I expected. I had imagined someone loud or overdone, the sort of woman wealth often turns theatrical. Instead, she was composed. Elegant. Almost understated. Her coat was cream-colored cashmere. Her hair was pinned neatly at the back of her neck. Her smile was calm, controlled, and so practiced that it made me uneasy before I understood why. She embraced Emily first. Then she turned to me. "You must be Rachel," she said. "We're so happy Emily has entered our family." The words were warm. But her eyes were not. She looked at me as if she were measuring fabric she might or might not buy. Not cruelly. Not openly. Worse than that. Politely. At dinner, everything seemed smooth enough. Ryan charmed. Emily laughed. Margaret asked about the town, about my late husband, about how long I had lived in Redwood Hollow. Nothing she said could be called rude. But every question felt as though it had another purpose beneath it. She listened too carefully. She smiled a little too slowly. And once, when Emily left the table to answer a call, Margaret glanced around my kitchen with a look so brief most people would have missed it. I did not miss it. It was not admiration. It was assessment. That night, after they left, Emily lingered by the door before getting into Ryan's car. She kissed my cheek, then lowered her voice and said, "Mom, there's something about Margaret that scares me." I remember smiling and telling her she was probably just nervous. I wish now that I had listened more carefully. At first, I told myself Emily was only adjusting to a different kind of family. That is what mothers do when they sense danger but do not yet have proof. We soften what frightens us. We rename it. We call it discomfort, nerves, class difference, personality. Anything but the truth. For a while, that explanation seemed easier. Margaret Blake always knew how to behave in public. She never raised her voice. She never said anything openly cruel. She moved through rooms with the calm assurance of a woman who had spent her whole life being listened to. People admired that in her. They called her gracious, polished, charitable. In the city, her name opened doors. Her photograph appeared in newspapers beside oversized checks and smiling children. She ran a large foundation that donated to schools, hospitals, and literacy programs. To most people, she looked like the kind of woman you should trust without question. But trust is not built by photographs. It is built in private moments. And in private, Margaret was different. The first sign was so small I nearly dismissed it. A few weeks after that first dinner, Emily called me late one evening. I could hear traffic in the background and the thin strain in her voice that she tried to hide. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Nothing," she said too quickly. "I'm just tired." I waited. Then she gave a little sigh and said, "Margaret corrected me in front of everyone tonight." "About what?" Emily hesitated. "About how I spoke to one of the board members. She said women from stable families know how to make people feel respected without sounding eager." I remember gripping the phone a little tighter. "That sounds insulting," I said. Emily laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. She smiled the whole time she said it. That was Margaret's way. Everything came wrapped in silk. Nothing could be quoted back as cruelty, yet cruelty was always there. After that, the incidents became more frequent. Little comments at dinners. Questions that sounded harmless until you noticed where they landed. Margaret once asked Emily whether she found it difficult to adapt to a more refined world. Another time she laughed lightly and said, "Ryan has always been generous with strays." She said it while arranging flowers in a crystal vase, as if the sentence itself were just another decorative detail. Emily told me these things in pieces. Never all at once. A sentence here. A memory there. She was embarrassed, I think. Not only because Margaret belittled her, but because Ryan rarely defended her. He would kiss her forehead afterward, tell her his mother was old-fashioned, tell her not to take everything so personally. That is how doubt begins. Not with a blow, but with repetition. One person wounds you, another person explains the wound away. Months passed. Emily began volunteering at one of the educational centers funded by the Blake Foundation. She had always been the sort of girl who wanted to be useful, even as a child. If she saw someone carrying too much, she reached out to help. If a teacher mentioned a student who needed supplies, Emily would quietly buy notebooks and leave them on the desk before class. So of course she took the position seriously. Of course she believed the foundation really stood for something good. At first, she liked the work. She liked the children. She liked the teachers who were trying to make something decent out of too little money and too much need. Then, slowly, she began noticing things that did not add up. One afternoon she mentioned, almost casually, that the center had canceled a tutoring program because a promised grant had never arrived. "That's odd," she told me on the phone. "The grant was announced publicly months ago." "Maybe it was delayed," I said. "That's what they told me." Her voice changed after that. Not frightened yet. Just alert. A week later she called again. This time she sounded angrier. "A teacher showed me an equipment request that was approved on paper last spring," she said. "Computers, printers, software licenses. Thousands of dollars worth. None of it was ever delivered. Did you ask anyone?" "Yes." And suddenly everybody got nervous. I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at my backyard while she spoke. The late afternoon light was fading, and I remember feeling, very clearly, that the air around me had changed. Emily kept going. "There are numbers in their reports that don't match what the schools actually received. Whole categories of expenses have been signed off, but the money never reached the programs." "Emily," I said quietly, "be careful." There was a short silence. Then she answered in a voice I knew well. The voice she used when she had already decided something. "Mom, I think Margaret is stealing from the foundation." Those words sat between us like a live wire. I did not want to believe them. Not because I trusted Margaret, but because the accusation was too large, too dangerous, too ugly to enter ordinary life without breaking it apart. "Are you certain?" I asked. "Not yet," Emily said. "But I'm close." That was the beginning. After that, the red flags were everywhere. Emily started making copies of documents. Budget summaries. Internal memos. Transfer records. She discovered shell vendors with respectable names and empty histories. She found payments approved for programs that did not exist, maintenance costs assigned to buildings no one could identify, consulting fees routed through private accounts tied to people Margaret had known for years. Every trail curved back toward the same polished center. Margaret Blake. The woman from the newspaper. The woman with the perfect smile. The woman who kissed children on the forehead for cameras and spoke about service at charity galas under chandeliers. The more Emily uncovered, the more the family atmosphere changed. Ryan grew distant. Margaret grew watchful. And Emily, for the first time in her life, began to sound truly afraid. Back on that deserted road, I bent closer to Emily and tried to keep my voice steady, though my whole body was shaking. The man who had found her stood a few feet away with his phone in his hand, waiting for instructions as if I were the one who knew what to do. But I did not know what to do. I only knew that my daughter was bleeding in my arms, whispering the name of the woman she had once tried so hard to tolerate for the sake of her marriage. "Emily," I said softly, brushing the hair from her forehead, "look at me. Stay with me." Her lips trembled. Her good eye opened a little wider, and she tried to lift herself, but the effort sent a sharp wave of pain through her body. She gasped and sank back against my arm. "Don't move," I told her. She swallowed hard, and I saw panic gathering in her face faster than tears. "It was Margaret," she whispered again. "She told me to get in the car. She said she needed to show me something. Land, for a children's project." Her voice broke on the last words. The man beside us shifted uneasily and turned away, as if he understood he was hearing something meant for the police and not for him. But the police felt far away in that moment, almost unreal. All that felt real was Emily's breath, thin and ragged, brushing against my wrist. "What happened?" I asked. She closed her eyes for a second and then forced them open again. "She drove me out here," she said. She kept smiling. She kept talking like everything was normal. A chill went through me. That was exactly how I had always imagined Margaret would do it if she ever decided to stop pretending. Not with rage. Not with chaos. With calm. With control. With that same elegant voice she used at fundraisers and board dinners, the voice that made lies sound like courtesy. Emily's fingers twitched weakly against my sleeve. "She said I didn't understand how families like theirs survive," she whispered. "She said blood matters. Reputation matters. She said my blood would ruin everything." I felt my chest tighten so painfully that for a moment I thought I might not be able to breathe. Then Emily turned her face slightly and winced. "She had a tire iron in the trunk," she said. "I didn't even see it until she came toward me." The man beside us muttered something under his breath and looked sick. I held Emily a little more carefully, as if my hands could somehow shield her from what had already happened. "She hit me once," Emily said. "Then again when I tried to run." Her voice had become so faint I had to lean down until my ear was almost at her lips. "I thought she was going to kill me." Those words entered me like ice. For a second I could hear nothing except the dry wind moving through the grass and the distant ticking of the truck engine cooling behind me. Not just violence. Not just anger. Intent. Margaret Blake had brought my daughter to an abandoned road under false pretenses and beaten her there. There was no misunderstanding left to hold on to. No softer explanation. No room for doubt. "Listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm calling an ambulance right now." The moment I said it, Emily grabbed my wrist. Her grip was weak, but desperate. "No hospital." I stared at her. "Emily." "No hospital," she repeated, this time with a burst of fear that made her whole body tremble. "Please, Mom. You need help." Her eye filled with tears. "Ryan will protect her." That sentence landed harder than anything else she had said. Not because it surprised me completely, but because hearing it aloud turned suspicion into reality. Ryan knew. Or if he did not know everything, he would choose his mother over the truth. Money does that to people sometimes. So does name. So does the long habit of protecting what benefits you. This was no longer only about what Margaret had done in the woods. It was about power. About influence. About a family whose money reached into boards, charities, law offices, city halls. And suddenly I understood why Emily was more afraid of being found than of being injured. If the wrong people took control of the story, she would not become a victim. She would become a problem. "We have to do something," I said. Emily swallowed and looked at me with a kind of exhausted clarity I had never seen in her before. "There are files," she whispered. "Copies. Emails. Transfers. I saved everything." "Where?" "At the apartment. And OneDrive, hidden." Her breathing caught again, and she shut her eyes. The stranger stepped closer then and said in a low voice, "Ma'am, she needs a doctor." "I know," I said. And I did know. But I also knew Emily was terrified in a way that had nothing to do with pain. Terrified of disappearing inside the machinery of another family's protection. There are moments in life when the world narrows so completely that only one decision remains visible. Standing there beside my daughter, with dusk gathering around us and fear pressing in from every side, I understood that I could not trust the Blake family, and I could not trust any chain of events that began with their influence. So I did the only thing I could think of. I called the only person I still believed would come when I asked and stand where he was needed. My brother Daniel. He answered on the second ring. "Rachel?" I did not waste a single word. "Daniel," I said, "Emily's been attacked. I need you now." There was silence on the line for half a second. Then his voice changed. "I'm coming." At that moment, I thought help was finally on the way. I had no idea yet that by the time Daniel arrived, the trap around us would already be closing. 2 days later, we arranged the family meeting. By then Emily was able to sit up for short periods, though every movement still cost her something. Daniel had brought her to a private place outside town instead of a hospital, just as she begged us to do. I told myself I was protecting her. I told myself we only needed a little time to think clearly, to gather what she had hidden, to decide how to move before the Blake family could get ahead of us. That was the lie I held on to. The truth was simpler. I was afraid. Afraid of their money. Afraid of their lawyers. Afraid that once the wrong people put their hands on the story, my daughter would be turned into a liar, a hysterical woman, an unstable wife with bruises no one could explain properly. Wealth has a language of its own. It can make evidence sound emotional and cruelty sound respectable. The meeting was Daniel's idea. We put everyone in one room, he told me. No phone calls. No delays. No games. Let them see what she survived and hear what she knows. At the time, it sounded reasonable. Emily sat quietly in the passenger seat on the way there, her face pale, one side still yellowed with fading bruises. She held her handbag in her lap the whole drive, both hands wrapped around it as if it contained the last stable thing in her life. In a way, it did. Inside that bag was a flash drive, copies of ledgers, email printouts, account names, dates, transfers, signatures. Enough to destroy reputations, foundations, marriages, and maybe prison walls if the right people ever saw it. We met in a private room behind Daniel's office downtown, a windowless space usually used for contract signings and settlement talks. A polished table ran through the center. The air smelled faintly of coffee, paper, and the stale chill of overworked air conditioning. It was the sort of room designed to make people feel serious. Ryan arrived first. He looked exhausted, but not shocked. That was the first thing I noticed. A husband who had just learned his wife had nearly been killed should have looked shattered. Ryan looked cornered. Then came Thomas Blake, tall, silver-haired, immaculate even in crisis. He spoke little, only nodded once in my direction as if we were attending a board dispute instead of standing at the edge of moral ruin. Margaret came last. She wore navy wool and pearl earrings. No apology. No visible fear. Only that same calm face I had hated from the first day I met her. For one long second, no one spoke. Then Emily stood up. Her movements were careful, but her voice was clear. She looked straight at me and said, "Mom, my mother-in-law was right." The room went silent. Not ordinary silence. The kind that falls when something rehearsed has finally reached its cue. Before I could even process those words, Daniel slowly rose from his chair. He did not look at Emily. He looked at me. "You should have stayed out of this, Rachel." My chest tightened so suddenly I had to grip the edge of the table. I turned toward him, waiting for some sign that I had misunderstood, that he was playing a role to corner the Blakes, that he had some plan I had not been told. Instead, he opened a folder and pushed several sheets across the polished surface. Bank transfers. Consulting agreements. Foundation correspondence. His name was everywhere. Not on the stolen money itself, no. Daniel was too careful for that. But there, in line after line, was proof that he had been helping the Blake family bury problems for years. Restructuring records. Redirecting audits. Quietly moving questionable payments through legal channels until theft looked like accounting error. I stared at the pages until the words blurred. "You?" I whispered. Daniel gave a tired sigh, almost irritated. It got bigger than anyone intended. That sentence told me everything. Not guilt. Not shame. Only inconvenience. Ryan finally spoke then, running a hand over his face. Emily should never have gone digging. Margaret's eyes shifted to her son, sharp and warning, but the damage was already done. This had never been a misunderstanding. It had never been one violent woman acting alone. It was a system. Family protecting family. Men protecting money. Professionals protecting themselves. And I had walked straight into the middle of it thinking blood still meant loyalty. I felt sick. Truly sick. Betrayal is not always loud. Sometimes it arrives in a neat stack of papers and a brother's flat voice. Then something changed. Emily smiled. Only slightly. But enough. Daniel noticed it first. "What is that?" he asked. Emily set her bag on the table and rested one hand on it. "You all thought these were the only copies," she said softly. No one moved. Then she added, "I sent everything to federal investigators yesterday morning." For the first time, Margaret lost control of her face. Just for a second. "But I saw it." Ryan swore under his breath. Thomas Blake straightened, every line of him suddenly alert. And Emily, my bruised and battered daughter, kept going. "This meeting is being recorded." The words had barely left her mouth when there was movement outside the door. Heavy steps. Voices. Then the handle turned. And the police came in. No one spoke for the first few seconds after the officers entered. It was as if the entire room had forgotten how sound worked. The door swung wider, and two uniformed officers stepped in first, followed by a man in a dark suit carrying a leather folder under his arm. He did not look rushed. He looked prepared. That frightened me more than if they had burst in shouting. Prepared meant Emily had been right. Prepared meant this had already moved beyond family lies and polite denials. Prepared meant the truth had finally found its own way into the room. Margaret Blake rose slowly from her chair. Even then, even with police standing 3 feet away, she tried to hold herself together with the same careful dignity she wore at charity banquets and public luncheons. Her chin lifted. Her hands remained still. Only her eyes betrayed her, moving too quickly from face to face, calculating. Thomas Blake stood beside her, rigid and pale. Ryan looked as though the ground had opened beneath him, but not because his wife had suffered. I saw it clearly then. He looked destroyed because the walls protecting his family had finally cracked in public. And Daniel did not move at all. He sat staring at the papers in front of him, one hand flattened against the table, his face drained of color. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not innocent. Not ashamed enough to ease anything in me. Just smaller. A man reduced to the size of his own choices. One of the officers spoke first and asked everyone to remain seated. His voice was calm. Professional. That calmness spread through the room in the strangest way. Not as comfort, but as finality. The moment for persuasion had ended. The moment for influence, for family pressure, for private arrangements behind closed doors, had passed. What remained now was record, testimony, procedure. Things people like the Blakes spent their lives trying to manage. Emily sat very still beside me. I turned to look at her, and for the first time since I had found her on the quarry road, I saw something in her face that was not fear. Exhaustion, yes. Pain, certainly. But beneath both of those, there was resolve. She had known exactly what she was doing when she walked into that room. She had looked at the people who thought they could bury her and had chosen, quietly and without drama, to bury their secrets instead. An investigator asked for the flash drive. Emily handed it over with trembling fingers. Then he asked whether she was willing to make a full statement. She nodded. Ryan finally found his voice. "Emily," he said, and I will never forget how pathetic he sounded in that moment, "you don't have to do this." She turned to him slowly. "No," she said. "I should have done it sooner." It was not loud. It was not theatrical. That was what made it powerful. Margaret tried once to interrupt, but the officer nearest her stopped her with a quiet instruction, and that seemed to shock her more than anything else. Women like Margaret are used to being listened to. She had probably not been silenced in decades. Daniel closed his eyes. I looked at him and felt something inside me tear in a place that would never mend properly again. There are betrayals you can survive and still remain yourself. Then there are betrayals that rearrange your history. My brother had belonged to my whole life. Childhood winters. Funerals. Birthdays. The kind of shared memory that becomes part of how you understand your own name. And now every memory had a shadow behind it. I had called him because I trusted him. I had brought my wounded daughter into a room he had prepared for our surrender. That knowledge sat in my chest like stone. Margaret Blake was arrested that same night. So was Daniel. Thomas was not taken immediately, but I saw in the investigator's face that his turn would come. Men like him rarely touch the dirtiest work directly. They build distance and call it innocence. But distance leaves records too. Ryan was left standing in the room after the officers had begun leading people out. He looked at Emily as though he still expected her to save him from the consequences of his own silence. She did not. Neither did I. When the room finally emptied, I remained seated for a moment because my legs would not cooperate. The polished table, the paper cups, the humming light overhead, the stale coffee smell, every ordinary detail seemed sharpened by what had just happened. Emily reached for my hand. I held hers and felt how cold it still was. "We're done," she whispered. At first I did not understand what she meant. Then I did. Done hiding. Done fearing. Done negotiating with people who mistook kindness for weakness. I nodded, though my throat was too tight for words. Outside, the night air felt colder than it had any right to be. Flashing lights painted the side of the building in red and blue. Somewhere down the street, someone was laughing, completely unaware that several lives had just broken open inside that office. The scandal spread fast after that. By morning, reporters were already circling the foundation. By evening, the first headlines were everywhere. Missing donations. Children's hospitals deprived of promised funds. School programs stripped hollow while gala photographs kept smiling. Millions gone. Careers destroyed. Reputations finished. My brother lost everything. And I lost someone I had once believed would stand beside me until the end of my life. But Emily survived. In the end, that was the truth that mattered most. Not the money. Not the headlines. Not the disgrace. My daughter survived. And when I lay awake that night listening to her breathe from the next room, bruised but alive, I understood that some losses are unbearable and some mercies are enough to keep you standing. She was still here. That had to be enough. Life did not become peaceful immediately after that night. In fact, for several weeks everything felt strangely unstable, as if the ground beneath our feet had shifted and had not yet decided where to settle again. Reporters continued calling. Investigators came and went. People I had not spoken to in years suddenly remembered my phone number and wanted to ask questions about the Blake family, about the foundation, about whether I had ever suspected anything before Emily discovered the truth. I answered what I could. Most of the time, I said very little. At my age, you learn that silence is sometimes the only dignified response left when the world becomes noisy with other people's curiosity. Emily stayed with me during those first months. Her recovery was slow. The bruises faded long before the deeper wounds did. Some nights she woke suddenly, breathing fast, the way she had breathed on that terrible road when I first found her. Other nights she could not sleep at all and would sit at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring quietly at a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink. I never asked her to explain those moments. Some things do not need explanation. They only need patience. Gradually, little signs of life began returning. Emily started walking again through the small park near my house. At first she could only manage a few minutes before the cold air made her shoulders tense. Later she stayed longer, sitting on a wooden bench beneath the maple trees, watching children chase each other through piles of leaves. One afternoon she came home carrying a small notebook. "I think I want to work again," she told me. "Already?" I asked gently. She nodded. But differently this time. The foundation scandal had spread across the country by then. Every news outlet seemed determined to dig through years of financial records, exposing just how deeply the corruption had run. Entire departments were shut down. Grants were frozen. Programs were investigated. Many innocent employees lost their positions simply because the organization itself had been poisoned from the top. Emily watched those reports quietly. "I don't want to work for people like that ever again," she said. "What do you want to do?" She thought for a long moment. "I want to build something honest." There was no anger in her voice. No bitterness. Only a calm determination I had never seen in her before. In the spring, she rented a small office above a bookstore downtown. It was nothing like the polished headquarters of the Blake Foundation. The furniture came from second-hand shops. The carpet smelled faintly of old dust. The window overlooked a narrow street where delivery trucks rattled past every morning. But the work that began there felt real. Emily started organizing independent education programs for schools that had lost their funding during the scandal. She partnered with teachers, volunteers, and small community groups. Instead of large donations controlled by distant boards, she built networks of local support that could not easily be stolen from behind closed doors. It was slower. Messier. But it belonged to the people who needed it. And slowly, the life she thought she had lost began forming again. Months passed. The trials began. Margaret Blake's name appeared in headlines for reasons very different from the ones she had enjoyed before. Her foundation was dismantled piece by piece under federal investigation. Several executives accepted plea deals. My brother Daniel stood in court and admitted to charges I still cannot repeat without feeling something inside my chest tighten. I attended none of those hearings. Some wounds heal better when you stop looking at them. Instead, I stayed where I was most needed. Beside my daughter. By autumn, Emily had moved into a small house just 15 minutes away from mine. Close enough that we could see each other often, but far enough that she could rebuild her independence without feeling watched. The house was modest. White siding. A tiny porch. A garden she began planting almost immediately. I visited one afternoon while she was kneeling in the soil, carefully pressing young tomato plants into the ground. "You always liked growing things," I told her. She smiled faintly. "I guess after everything, it feels good to watch something grow instead of fall apart." The following year brought a quieter miracle. Emily's daughter was born in early summer. When I held that tiny child in my arms for the first time, wrapped in a pale yellow blanket, I felt something shift deep inside me. Not joy exactly. Joy was too loud for that moment. It was something calmer. Something steadier. Hope. Emily named the baby Zora. After my grandmother. A woman who had once told me something I did not fully understand until much later in life. "Strength isn't loud," she used to say. "It's the quiet decision to stand up when everyone expects you to fall." When I look at little Zora now, sleeping peacefully in the small crib beside Emily's bed, I sometimes think about that night in the woods. About the silence in that room before the police arrived. About the terrible moment when I realized the people I trusted had already chosen their side. Life does not erase those memories. But it does something else. It builds new ones beside them. And slowly, those new memories begin to carry more weight than the old ones ever did. Sometimes betrayal does not come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the people we trusted most. The ones who shared our tables, our memories, and our quiet assumptions about loyalty. For a long time, I believed that truth alone was enough to protect a person. Life taught me something different. Truth needs courage. And courage rarely feels heroic while you are living through it. Most of the time it feels like fear, uncertainty, and the stubborn decision to stand your ground even when everyone around you expects you to step back. Some names and small details in this story have been changed to protect privacy, but the events themselves come from very real experiences. And now I'm curious about something. What would you have done in my place? Would you have trusted the system or protected your family first? Write your answer in the comments. And if stories like this stay with you, consider subscribing and watching the next one. Sometimes the next story begins exactly where the last one leaves us.